This week on the Catholic Vote Radio Hour,
the men that would attack my views would then turn around and try to date me or take me out.
Ew.
Yeah.
Amber Athey of the Daily Caller answers the question, is gun control sexist?
John Podesta and George Soros were creating faux Catholic organizations presenting a fake Catholic social justice.
The world is on fire, but a new book by Jason Jones and John Zmirak fights back.
I'm going to continue exposing the truth about Sudan until the Trump administration says, we got this wrong.
Faith McDonnell of the Institute on Religion and Democracy fights for the victims of Islam in South Sudan.
In the early days of broadcasting, few people realized what a fine art radio was to become.
Hello, you're listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, the only show that is used and recommended by 80% of exorcists. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid.
Government can't control everything without controlling me, what I can say and what I can't say. And I mean police control. It tells me where I'll work, where I'll live, and all the rest of it.
Thank you for joining me for a second time. Amber Athey of the Daily Caller, great reporter, and you've been on top of this week's explosion of conversation about sexism, but there's also another little thing going on, which is there's been a boost in discussions of gun control, and what I'm interested in is the fact that we're talking about sexual harassing of women and threats to women, and then meanwhile, Dana Lash, who's an NRA spokesperson, announced that her husband and her kids and she are all having to move because of all the threats of violence against them for being members of the NRA.
Yeah, it's really wild. And unfortunately, it's not all that surprising to me because being a conservative woman in media, most of the evil things people say to me online and the threats do come from leftists who are mad at my politics. And it's really interesting that it's the same people who claim to be for women's equality and women's rights are the ones who are willing to shut down and even threaten conservative women solely because they don't agree with their politics. And I think real feminism, real women's equality should be respecting the choices that women make, and especially the choices they make when it comes to their own intellectual convictions.
That's interesting that you say true feminism, in your view, is something that has to do with respecting women's intellectual convictions, whereas the left's whole message is women have a right to their bodies. Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're a little bit more kind of high-minded here. It's interesting to me that a conservative woman would say, I take a lot of heat, and it's because of ideas, of actual convictions, because of my character that I'm attacked, whereas other women are just sort of like, because we are female and have these parts, we must be granted these special privileges, and they must be paid for by other people. The two don't even compare, in my view. I'm sorry, I'm biased because my wife is a total misogynist, anti-feminist.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't consider myself a feminist either. And part of that is because I do disagree with the fundamental premise. Not that you shouldn't be allowed to do with your body whatever you want, but that you should. I disagree with feminists that because we are free and because we are women, that we somehow have to over-sexualize ourselves in order to prove that point. I don't think that's a very healthy way to express your femininity.
Right. You mentioned that you do get harassed to some degree for your conservatism as a woman in politics and in punditry. How often does that happen and to what degree?
I don't get it as much as I think someone like Dana does, mainly because I don't have as large of a following. But I definitely got it a lot when I was in college because I was not only a female conservative, but I was also the head of the college Republicans on campus. So I definitely had a target on my back for both of those. And the thing that was always funny to me was a lot of the men that would attack me for my views would then turn around and try to date me or take me out.
Ew.
Yeah. So it almost felt like they were using me for my looks, which is what liberal men claim that they do the opposite. They claim that conservative men only care about women's appearances. So I wouldn't understand why they would want to come after my views, but then also somehow want to be involved with me romantically.
Ew. That's really interesting to me. You're saying that you were romantically approached by the same people who attacked you intellectually.
Yes, and then if I would turn them down, the intellectual attacks would get harsher sure.
Wow. I mean, I'm blown away because when I asked you the question, Amber, I was thinking about like social media trolls. But you're talking about actual personal interactions in college. I had no idea.
Yes, which I think is worse. Well, I mean, the social media trolls certainly are terrible. I mean, I've had people in my Twitter mentions saying that I must have been raped as a child or just terribly disgusting things. But for me, I don't know those people, so it doesn't really bother me a whole lot.
Right.
And it's one thing sort of like in Dana's situation, she has direct threats, people talking about knowing her address and coming to her house.
Yeah.
I've never received a direct threat through people on social media like that, at least not through anonymous trolls.
Right.
So unless it's like a direct threat on me, I just kind of mute them and ignore it.
Right. And to tell you the truth, Amber, I actually don't think that usually citing trolls on social media amounts to much. The thing that makes it substantial for Dana, though, unfortunately, is she's had people post her address along with messages like one person who shared her address to his followers on social media said that he planned to, quote, rape her to death. I mean, that is really frightening.
Right.
And you know what? It totally proves her entire life works point.
That's exactly right. It's the same people who talk about protecting women, especially from sexual assault, for example, and yet they want to leave women defenseless. Here's a good example. So I'm also a gun owner. I've never felt safer than when I've owned a gun.
Wow.
And luckily I live in Virginia, which is, they have fairly loose gun restrictions and you can have a concealed carry permit.
Mm-hmm.
DC is a lot stricter, and I work in DC.
Right.
The Supreme Court they declined to take a case to the Supreme Court that would keep restrictions on CCPs in DC. So it's easier to get a CCP now.
Concealed carry permit, just to be clear, right?
Yes. So in DC, you cannot carry on the metro. You cannot carry within 1,000 feet of a school. You can't carry anywhere close to the National Mall. Obviously, you can't carry in government buildings. That's understandable. But just me going to work in the morning precludes me from being able to carry a licensed firearm because I have to ride the metro to work.
Right.
So basically they're saying, well, we have concealed carry, but not really because you can't really do it anywhere.
Right. Now, so as a woman and a gun owner and a person who has actually had to deal with sleazeballs going after you in college, both attacking you and the reverse in a way, what do you think, what is the effectiveness of gun control versus owning a gun?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's not even comparable because when you're looking especially at DC, they have some of the most onerous restrictions and yet they have so much gun crime that it's impossible to me that people think that by tightening restrictions on legal gun owners, they're somehow going to stop the people who stalk under cover of night and sexually assault women.
Oh.
It's crazy to me.
They have passed very restrictive gun control laws in DC, and it has not had the effect of reducing the number of gun owners who are prone to attack. They still have their guns illegally, and meanwhile you, a potentially vulnerable young woman, are the only one who does not carry a gun because you're afraid of the law.
That's exactly right. And actually in DC, if you are a legal gun owner and you break one of the rules while carrying a gun, you face a doubly harsh penalty. So for anyone who is a lawful gun owner, you would never even dream of breaking the rules that they put in place.
Right.
For someone who's already planning on raping or murdering someone, what does that matter to them?
Right. They're more likely to be desperate or people with less to lose.
That's exactly right.
So what do you think? Is gun control sexist?
I don't think it's intentionally sexist, but I certainly think it can be, considering women are already at a disadvantage in terms of being able to defend themselves physically against men. Obviously, men are stronger, they're bigger. That's sexist, though. I know, right? You can't say that, but it's true. So being at a disadvantage physically, the gun is what they call it the great equalizer, because a woman with a gun obviously will be able to defend herself against a man, whether he has a gun or a knife or whatever. One of the arguments that gun control activists make, which I think is very sexist, is they say women who own guns are more likely to end up harming themselves or more likely to have the gun taken away from them by the person committing a crime against them. First of all, I think it's pretty sexist to say that women are not responsible enough or can't get the training required to own a gun responsibly. Especially members of the NRA are actually the safest gun owners in the country and commit the least amount of crimes. In terms of the argument of having the weapon used against you, I'll point to an actual rape survivor. Her name is Amanda Collins. She was raped on a college campus in a gun-free zone. When people make that argument to her, she says, well, I would have rather died trying to fight off my attacker than to have been completely helpless the way that I was.
Wow, that's really moving. unfortunately, this is a common experience. That's why the hashtag is going around, the hashtag #MeToo. Many women do feel vulnerable, but I've heard that in most gun confrontations, the gun's never fired.
Right.
In other words, if somebody's trying to bother you and you just show them that you have a holster on you, they tend to go away.
Yeah, that's usually enough. In college, when I wasn't able to carry a firearm, I carried a knife, and I've had incidents where I've had to flash it or indicate that I had one just to get someone away from me. You know, I've had someone stalk me after a party. It's definitely a very common experience among women, and it's baffling to me that gun control activists and just progressives in general would want to disarm women and make them less capable of protecting themselves.
Right. You know, it's a regular old Democratic Party war on women, it sounds like. That's what we got our hands.
That's right.
So you continue to carry your gun, and hopefully we'll get it to the point where you can carry it on the metro in D.C.
Yeah,
oh my gosh,
nice.
This is the most politically incorrect interview. Fight back, not using violence, but using our intellectual powers. Because, believe it or not, this is a little message to the left, women have intellectual powers. You don't believe
scary,
it,
I know. We don't all believe the same thing.
Right. All right. Well, thank you again for being with me, Amber, and I look forward to having you on again. This has been a very insightful interview, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm joined now by Jason Jones, founder and president of I Am Whole Life, Movie to Movement, and ServiamUSA.org. Jason has just come out with a new book. It's a sequel to a previous book that I've already read, The Race to Save Our Century. This one is called The World is on Fire, and it's got a similarly urgent message, doesn't it, Jason?
It does. Thanks for having me on, Stephen. I started writing The World is on Fire in the late 1990s as really just an exercise in trying to understand what were the causes of democide, genocide, and total war in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. What made the 20th century the bloodiest, most sorrowful century in the history of the human family? And then I saw trends that were pointing towards an even more bloody 21st century. What The Race to Save Our Century does, which you should really read first, is it looks at the root causes of genocide, democide, and total war and applies Catholic social teaching, showing how that we as lay Catholics have really the most important role of creating a culture of peace and love and leaving that to our posterity. The World on Fire applies the principles of Catholic social teaching to the problems of today, everything from Obama's drone war to how best to provide for the security of Christians in Iraq and Syria, to abortion, to immigration, to the gender wars. Whatever the issues of the day are, we look at it thoughtfully through the lens of Catholic social teaching. And my writing partner, John Zmirak, I think is really just one of the sharpest minds and one of the best writers today. So it's just been a privilege.
He certainly is, yeah.
It was a privilege for me to have him as my writing partner.
Awesome. So it's like I said, I read The Race to Save Our Century that came out a couple of years ago, and I remember it being a totally unique take on some of the disastrous occurrences of the 20th century. And in this one, you're going to this century and directly applying it to current events, correct?
Yes. And, for me, there's just kind of a sense of urgency. For the past 30 years, I've been addled by losing my child to violence as a 17-year-old.
Right.
Ever since then, I've sort of spent my life trying to throw myself between the violent and the vulnerable. And I've been to Darfur in the height of the Civil War. I just recently returned from Iraq, where I was on the front lines with the Peshmerga as they were facing down ISIS. I saw a Yazidi girl who had been just rescued from an ISIS sex camp, a rape camp, and returned, a 9-year-old girl, and returned to her father.
Right.
So as an American, to be born into this Anglo-American political community, and as a Catholic, I recognize that I am the freest, most privileged, most influential Christian that has ever walked the face of the earth. If you are a lay Catholic in the United States, the power that is in your hands to leave to your children and grandchildren, to leave to our posterity a culture of life is really unimaginable. A very high-ranking member of the Kurdish government, I met with him about the plight of the Kurds and the Chaldeans and Assyrians, and he was begging for help, and I said, I want to manage your expectations. I'm just a little American. And he said, a little American can do more for my people than the biggest Kurd.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah, that's and that's what privilege is. I've been thinking actually a lot about privilege lately because there's so much talk about white privilege and class privilege and male privilege and all of this, and I keep thinking to myself, there's something deeply insightful about the concept of privilege. It does exist. The thing is that from a classical and traditional perspective, privilege is a good thing, and it's something that we're supposed to want for others, and if we have it, it's something that we're supposed to use in favor of those who don't have it.
I want to tell you, I was a 17-year-old infantryman on something called Cobra Gold in Thailand, on the border of Thailand and Cambodia, way up in the mountains. And I was on a forced 72-hour forced road march with my platoon. And there I was with 120 pounds on my back, an M60 machine gun in my hands. And we were in this village where a man was holding his dying child, dying of malaria. And It was at that moment, although I was from a broken home, a single mom, people would say we were poor. I never thought we were poor. I thought we were rich because we ate at Red Lobster once, and we once stayed at a Holiday Inn, and I could smell the pool from my room. I thought if you could stay at a hotel where you can smell the pool from your room, you're rich. But it was at that moment as a 17-year-old E1 private on the border of Cambodia, looking at this man helpless to protect his child. It was at that moment I knew how privileged I was. And I committed to myself that I am going to live my privilege. So by the time when I got out of the Army and went to the university, and by that time I was a parent. I had my first child at 18, second at 19. Now I'm a veteran of the infantry, working the night shift, going to college, and my liberal professors were trying to make me feel like a victim or some sort of underprivileged person. And it didn't stick because I had been around the world and I knew how privileged I was, you know, and I want to go back, Stephen, to why we wrote this book, John and I, and why we founded Servium. We founded this organization. It became a sense of urgency to me when it was revealed through WikiLeaks that John Podesta and George Soros were spending countless millions of dollars furiously creating faux Catholic organizations presenting a fake Catholic social justice that really just was a pesticide to the free institutions of civil society, those intermediary institutions that are so important to protecting the vulnerable, and advocated for a statism, destroyed subsidiarity, undermined human dignity. It really, at the heart of it, Podesta and Soros' ideology attacks Catholic social teaching's core tenets at their heart.
Right.
René Girard said, when Christians become victimists, there is no one left to defend the vulnerable. And that's the mission of Servium, to live in solidarity with the vulnerable to the point of our own vulnerability. That's what it is to be a Christian, to promote those free institutions of civil society, to promote economic, religious, and political freedom, to advocate for the incomparable dignity of the human person, to really fight for subsidiarity, fight for those institutions closest to the human person, the family, the church, to push the state out of an ideology out of every corner of our lives that it's seeking to push into. And this book is useful for those of you who are also committed to a humane, flourishing republic for our posterity.
Amen. That's great. Yeah, I can't wait to read it, by the way. I'm going to get it today and take a look at it. I'm really glad that you mentioned the leaked emails from Podesta where we discovered what he called the Catholic Spring. And it's greatly in response to that I myself have a renewed vigor in the work I do with CatholicVote and the CatholicVote Radio Hour. We have to respond to that. It is a threat. These people are immeasurably wealthy and influential.
Stephen, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I know bishops and other influential people listen to you. You know, I want to know why the bishops didn't respond to that. This is not a conspiracy theory like the Russians seeking to influence the election, you know, where they spent $100,000 on Google Analytics. This is a fact. Soros and Podesta are spending millions to rob the Catholic Church of its voice, to rob the preborn child of its defenders, to rob the Chaldeans and Assyrians of an effective voice in Washington. So we need people of power and influence listening to this to really stand up and collide into these Podestanistas and Soros front groups.
Amen, especially when there are, unfortunately, people in high echelons in the church who are all too willing to actually cooperate with them.
Sorrowful, pitiful souls.
Yeah. All right, well, again, we're talking about this new book by Jason Jones and John Zmirak. It's called The World is on Fire. The subtitle is A Whole Life Reader.
That's it, and it's at Amazon.com right now. And I suggest you get The Race to Save Our Century and The World is on Fire. We were just overwhelmed with how well received The Race to Save Our Century was, and now it's being used in classrooms and from China to Kurdistan.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And I'm glad you've written it. And again, we'll have you back again soon, Jason. And it's always an honor to have you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Right now, It's a season of war against a GOP establishment. These folks are coming for you. The day of taking a few nice conservative votes and hiding is over.
Well, we were just listening to a clip of Steve Bannon declaring war on the Republican establishment, which he did at the Values Voter Summit just last week. To talk with us about whether that'll be a good thing or a bad thing and everything in between is Catholic Vote Political Director Josh Mercer. What the heck is going on?
I think what's going on here with Steve Bannon, he's extremely upset. He wants to get rid of Mitch McConnell. He wants new leadership in the Senate. And his way of doing it is to target Republican incumbents. These are senators from even safe Republican states like Deb Fischer from Nebraska, John Barrasso from Wyoming, Roger Wicker from Mississippi. He wants to have new conservatives come up and challenge these Republican senators and defeat them in a primary and go to Washington and replace Mitch McConnell and get someone new as the Senate Majority Leader.
He said in a recent interview with Sean Hannity, there's a coalition of people that are going to be personally going through the portfolios of and vetting new candidates. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, what Bannon's trying to get at is he wants to put the fear of death into some of these Republicans. If you look at the voting records of Deb Fischer and John Barrasso and Roger Wicker, their voting records are not bad. I mean, they're all pro-life. They support religious liberty. They voted to repeal Obamacare. So what's the problem, right? I mean, they're right on all the issues. Well, the problem in Steve Bannon's mind is that they're just not getting anywhere. They're all stuck in neutral. And it's like you said, if we got elected to the majority, if we took back the Senate and we took back the White House, here are the things that we would get accomplished. So you have all the right views, but you're not accomplishing anything. That's the problem.
This is what Jason Jones calls people who are totally reliable except when it counts.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, what happens with Steve Bannon gives a speech at the Values Voter Summit on Saturday, and then 48 hours later, you look at Senator Roger Wicker's Twitter feed, and it's just 20 different tweets about how he's in favor of President Trump, the Trump agenda. I want to vote, let's get moving forward, make America great again. Let's get jobs and, healthcare, repeal Obamacare. And so the message was received. It's time for the Senate to get moving. Now, here's the thing. Politics, things can change rapidly.
Yep.
And so maybe Roger Wicker got the message and he's going to put a fire under other people's bellies. Maybe they're going to move forward and vote on stuff, get things approved and get it to the president's desk. The fact is, it's still possible. There's a lot of time left before the elections. If they want to get stuff done, if they want to repeal Obamacare, if they want to pass, a pro-family tax cut, if they want to have a vote on protecting human life in the womb, do these things, move forward with this agenda, and who knows? Mitch McConnell might get reelected majority leader because they got things done.
Because he got the message.
Yeah, because they got the message. They got things done. But if they don't, Lindsey Graham, who I don't always agree with, he said, if we don't pass a tax cut and do something on Obamacare, we're going to lose in 2018. And he's right.
Yeah.
The Republicans will lose. They will lose the House and the Senate. They'll never lose the Senate. No, you can lose the Senate too.
Yeah.
You can lose the House and the Senate. You could have Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. You could have Chuck Schumer running the Senate. And they'll start talking about Russia and impeachment. And then nothing gets done on any pro-life legislation, on tax cuts for families. It's all dead in the water. And so, again, you learn from your mistakes, you learn from your successes and your failures. So 2016 was a surprise. People did not expect Donald Trump to win, but he did. And people are starting to say, you know what, we have to rethink based on what the American people have decided and what they voted for. We need to start changing things. I think the biggest problem for the Republican Party for so long is that they ran the 1980 election every time. We have to be optimistic and talk about tax cuts. That's only things that matter. And Donald Trump turned the thing around. His mood was more negative than Ronald Reagan's sunny optimism. And so people are like, well, I don't think that's going to do well. Like, well, the American people are frustrated because they've seen a dysfunctional federal government for a long time. So somebody who was upset about how things were going on in Washington, it resonated with voters because that's where they were.
We've gone from gentle, careful, reasoned rhetoric to, I know you're all tired of gentle, careful, reasoned rhetoric. I know, as you know, this is the sort of Trumpian message, that erring on the side of caution is actually something that leads to more dangers.
We cannot tolerate a government that just doesn't ever get anything done, So I think the voters are upset at how things just aren't moving forward. And it seems like we have a national government in Washington, D.C. for a long time that's been sort of detached from the real authentic concerns of hardworking American families. And so it's time to change things up a little bit.
What do you predict will come of the the Steve Bannon threat of war.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Bob Corker decided to go ahead and retire right before that speech. And so Bob Corker said, I don't even want to have to try to run for office again under this environment. And so there might be more people like that who will just decide to retire and they won't run for office again. Some people will change their tune like Wicker, and some will do it quickly like he did, and some will kind of maybe it'll take them a while. Some of these primary challenges will probably be triumphant. I mean, I think Jeff Flake out of Arizona, the senator there, I don't understand his strategy. I think he's a goner. I think he loses the Republican primary there. So I think some of these guys will lose. I mean, like that's what happened in Alabama. The establishment Republican Luther Strange lost the special election there. And so I think, yes, a lot of the Republicans in the Beltway, they don't like things to be tumultuous. They like it predictable and safe. And the fact is the establishment Republican Party is really getting a wake-up call continually, and it's to the good because they screwed a lot of things up for a long time. So
it's amazing to me how Trump, a person that neither you nor I trusted during the primaries, he's sensitive to some of the cries of the poor, so to speak. Glad to see that he's following through on some of that, and Bannon being his sort of attack dog flank may help us see more of that. I'm continually willing to be pleasantly surprised even by people whom I initially disliked.
Well, I mean, again, case with him is that it was said that only Nixon could go to China, so it was only a strident, hardcore anti-communist that people would trust him, that he wouldn't sell out the country. And, well, there's also sort of like a flip to that, which is to say precisely because Donald Trump wasn't trusted on life issues, abortion, religious liberty, he had to make his case even stronger. No, I'll be good for this. I got to show you I can be good. I can be good.
Here are my promises on the pro-life issue in writing with my signature.
I'll write it down. He wrote a letter to us at CatholicVote. Here's what I'll do for religious liberty, And so it's precisely because there was that skepticism, we didn't take it on faith, that he had to prove it to himself, put it in writing, and here I'll even write down the name of the judges that I'll support. And so the big controversy this week are people like, oh, he doesn't even really believe it. He doesn't believe any of this stuff. And it's like, well, who knows what he really believes? I care more about his actions and what he does. And he did Mexico City policy and then some. He expanded on it. He gave us Gorsuch. He's given us all these great nominees for the federal bench.
He gave a victory to the Little Sisters of the Poor.
Certainly. And he said, you get that 20-week ban through the Senate and I'll sign it into law. So I have to say, from precisely the issues I care most about, he's been a pleasant surprise. It doesn't happen often in politics where a politician is better than you hope. Usually you get disappointed. I had such low expectations of Donald Trump on these issues. And so far, I've been very pleasantly surprised.
All right. Well, let's keep hoping and praying. I mean, actually, by the way, witches on a regular basis are cursing our president, so we might as well pray for him to counter that. At least that he sticks up for the interests of our faith and of the vulnerable, especially the unborn and the persecuted.
Yeah, and as Catholics, we always pray for our political leaders. So that's a tradition we should continue for sure.
Amen. Well, thank you again for joining us, Josh, and I can't wait to talk to you next week when we'll talk about how everything has turned out exactly as you hoped.
According to plan.
All right. Thanks again. Talk to you soon.
All right, bye.
I'm not gonna get home.
Now I'm sitting down with Faith McDonnell. She is a great role model for our listeners to pay attention to. She's the director of the Religious Liberty Program and the Church Alliance for a New Sudan for the Institute on Religion and Democracy. She is also a commentator and a very entertaining follow on social media as well. Faith, what I'd like to start with is just to note what a great representative you are of a group that is typically stereotyped. People do not think of white American evangelicals as being people that reach outside of their bubble and care for the truly vulnerable, and you break that mold because most of your friends are not even American. A lot of them are people in the Middle East and in Africa.
Hi, Stephen. Yes. First, let me say thank you for saying that I'm an entertaining follow. I strive to be. And yeah, I strive to break molds too. I really don't even like the word evangelical anymore. I'm afraid to say, but it's been co-opted by the left. People like the Sojourners and people like that. So I just call myself a Christian who believes in the scriptural authority and the lordship of Christ. Bible-believing Orthodox Christian. But yeah, it's still a stereotype because I'm a white middle-aged woman. But I hang out with Sudanese and Nigerians and people like that, North Korean defectors, and it's a wonderful life.
It's a wonderful life. And the people that you talk to, I would assume that not a lot of these conversations that you have with them are necessarily lighthearted content. You're talking about, you said defectors from North Korea?
Yeah.
Wow. Tell me about that.
That's really, it's quite an honor to have met some young defectors from North Korea in part of my work. One of our projects was Liberty in North Korea kind of project, and met some that way. And you're right, I said it's a wonderful life, but part of being wonderful is being willing to have your heart broken over and over again, listening to what people tell you and being outraged by the injustice. But then there are the points where, you learn things that other people don't learn, joyful things too. And, once you've danced with Nubians, you really have had quite an experience.
Danced with Nubians. I don't think I've ever done that at my parish, Faith.
Oh, you need to find some, Stephen.
Okay. Well, also, it's interesting what you said about the term evangelical. You think it's been co-opted. It's funny, speaking of stereotypes and breaking molds, the people who are thought of as the most caring Christians, I find, are not always so. We're talking about who are the people that would be part of the get-along gang, part of the sort of accepted evangelicals. Oh, well, he's an evangelical, but he's not the bad kind. People might introduce a person saying that. Those people you're not going to find them dancing with Nubians, are you?
Probably not. It depends, which issue you're talking about sometimes too. There's a lot of Christians who, for whatever reason, seem to be very caring and compassionate for people who are not Christians, but not for their fellow believers. Now, the Nubians I'm talking about, most of them are not believers, but they are still in this category of being those who resist the supremacism and imperialism of radical Islam, trying to make everybody the same in Sudan. But on the other hand, you've got the people who won't even look at their fellow Christians because they think, well, maybe they think they're more spiritual if they only care about people who are non-Christians, But I think Galatians 6:10 tells us something different.
And what's that?
It says to do good to all, but particularly to those who are of the household of faith. And they don't mean Faith McDonnell.
Well, you wish, right? You get a shout out in Scripture. That's pretty good. But who does get a shout out in Scripture, aside from those in the faith, is what Christ refers to as the least of these. And he warns us to treat them as if they are himself.
Yes.
And that's even, I would think, can you interpret that to mean even non-Christians who are that vulnerable? Is that right?
Yes. Oh, yeah, I would definitely think so. It is interesting, though, that passage comes right after Jesus talks about what to do when you're persecuted. Mm-hmm. So I like to see the connection there, that he's thinking of his followers who are persecuted, and then he just broadens it to say, all of those who are vulnerable and hungry and being victims of injustice.
Yeah, so this is a big thing I encounter frequently, Faith, and I'm learning to keep my temper better and better, by the way. I'm really glad. I've become more joyful, thanks in part because I follow you now, so I can ululate as well.
Oh, wow.
But yes, you say that on your Twitter bio. I like that.
Yeah.
But what I often encounter is Christians who have this kind of saccharine, rose-colored glasses outlook on, hey, what's the worst that can happen? So what if we are marginalized as Christians? Or so what if we're persecuted? Actually, the church tends to become stronger in the wake of persecution. And I hate that. I think that's a really dangerous and harmful attitude because here's my main reason. My main cause, by the way, is the pro-life movement. Mm-hmm. And also another one is protecting, like you, persecuted Christians and other minorities in the Middle East and Africa. And here's the thing. We as Christians are meant to be Christ to the vulnerable, right?
Right.
And we are actually, in the pro-life movement, as I like to point out, the main representative demographic. There are more Christian pro-lifers than any other kind. And so to be ambivalent about the undermining of Christian witness and influence and power in society is essentially to say, I'm willing to step out of the way as villains charge toward their victims. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to just step conveniently aside, and it doesn't matter. I don't care about the status of the church and the witness of the church in the world because I'm not worldly. And I say, well, then you're too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good.
Yes, that's a very good point, Stephen. I think mostly it's a cop-out. You can say that, oh, well, they're going to die and go to heaven anyway, and the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Right.
But if they turned it around and it was themselves, I wonder if they would feel differently. And I think that's why the Bible makes such a big point of saying that we are one body, and that when one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers, because we can't cop out like that. We have a responsibility, a God-given mandate to defend those who are being led to the slaughter, which, is one of the Bible verses which the pro-life movement has taken as gospel, which it is, but the same for the persecuted. It's one thing if it's somebody else, but if it was your child or your next door neighbor even, just the fact that we're many miles from other people doesn't mean that we have less responsibility to them. We should be doing everything we can. My friend Paul Marshall once said we should not sleep well at night unless we know that we've done everything we can. Now, we're not Jesus, we're not God Almighty, but we know what we can do, and we know if we're just shrugging off that responsibility and that brotherhood.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I agree. I see that principle that you just expressed diminishing in many Christian circles. It's become less and less popular. To see your Christian faith as primarily a call to service to others, rather than primarily a bag of goodies for oneself to comfort oneself as one goes through one's own life. Where did you get that, Faith? I mean, how was that instilled in you?
Well, I grew up in the Salvation Army, so that may have been part of it. My parents were officers in the Salvation Army, which means they were pastors. But I think for me, too, in addition to that and to having a godly mother and father, just when I became aware of what Christians in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were going through. So there, I've told you how old I am. But that was my first experience of knowing about the suffering church, was just picking up a little pamphlet on a table in a church and reading about this. I think it was a Latvian man who was in prison, a Catholic Latvian man who was in prison for his faith, and then being so intrigued by it that I started reading about all the different organizations that were doing advocacy for Christians in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and writing to them all and getting involved. And, when the wall fell down and the Soviet Union was gone, I thought, that's it. No more persecution of Christians. Boy, was I wrong.
Right. Whatever evil spirit was at the center of communism has not died. And it's quite stunning the degree to which the American left, they don't seem to mind flirting with those things.
No, I think that they have been indoctrinated from college age on, but there's a really interesting book called The Sword and the Shield. It's the Petrokhin files from the Soviet Union. They were a former KGB agent who released all these documents, and they talk about desensitizing the West to the dangers of communism, the dangers of Marxism, and infiltrating churches, infiltrating organizations and the educational system.
Right.
And the thing that really blows my mind is it's the same thing that Islam is doing today. desensitizing the West in many ways, getting into the churches with interfaith dialogue, with the idea of Islamophobia, anything that can desensitize us, not to Muslims, because we're called to love Muslims, but to Islam and the ideology that keeps people in bondage and in hatred and in fear.
Mm-hmm. Related, now that we've brought up Islam, tell me about your project with Sudan. It's very hard to communicate what is happening in Sudan.
Yes.
And it almost involves a sort of narrative arc to be told, starting from, maybe the 90s?
or you could go back to the days of 700 AD when Islam conquered Nubia. I mean, it's one of the most fascinating subjects that I've ever been involved with. And I think other than the fact that the people are so wonderful and I love them and I want to see them have freedom and justice and equality, it's just so fascinating that it's kept me going. I mean, I've been working on Sudan and South Sudan for 23 years now, and it doesn't get old. I mean, it's just, it's watching the Islamic regime in Sudan reform itself and re-image itself and survive all these years, even though it's a monstrous, atrocious regime. It's just fascinating, even though it's appalling. Right. But there is the arc, and to cut it really short, you had Sudan, you had after they got their independence from Britain, they started right away thinking about how they could be the most pure Islamic Arabic country in the world and how to get rid of the black African Sudanese who stood in the way of that. That particularly came to a head in 1989 when the current president, Omar al-Bashir, indicted by the International Criminal Court as a war criminal, came to power and started the war against the South. And then, you've read my article about the 5 genocides, and that's really being as modest as you can. There's even really more than that. But the South, Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile State, and the Nuba Mountains once again, which is what's happening now with both Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile State, with attacks on those areas. Right. And then, we've got this whole narrative now that the U.S. believes that Sudan has improved, not only in terms of its treatment of its own people, but that it's giving us good intelligence to help us in the war on terrorism. It just doesn't go along. And then South Sudan, what's happening? It's just... So
set the stage real quick from a very, very fresh ears perspective. Our listeners may be unfamiliar with a lot of this. I don't know how to block it out, but let's say the players are the current regime, the variety of locals, right, who are endangered. Mm-hmm. And then the third player, let's put it very broadly, as Western powers, superpowers, including the United States, starting under Obama. What was going on during that period of time, and why is it that we are so uninformed, and even the informed among us are so misinformed?
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to put it. You've got the regime, then the those that it's victimizing, we can refer to as the marginalized people groups, and then the West. So I think we've got many problems. One is that we have taken such a secular view of things for so many years that until 9/11, we didn't realize that religion played such a big role in world events and people's policies. Whereas for Sudan, that is their ground zero. So we had that problem. We have the problem of esteeming Arab culture over African. I mean, it's kind of a prejudice, I think. But
African culture, by the way, resembles roughly the sort of maligned fundamentalist cultural conservatism of the U.S. Really, really roughly, doesn't it?
It sure does, and it really a special way because, for instance, I'm an Anglican. I used to be an Episcopalian. And when those of us who believed in the Lordship of Christ and the authority of Scripture had to leave the church, it was our African brothers and sisters in the Anglican Communion that welcomed us in. So we have a big debt to them. But as you said, yeah, it's African culture in general, too. We tend to look at it and say, oh, they're always fighting in Africa. But nobody gives the benefit of the doubt and gets to what the root is, which a lot of the time, it's Islam, no matter which country you're talking about.
It's an insurgency of a foreign culture, correct? And local African culture, well, many of them actually are Christian. And so, in other words, whatever the Christians did, it worked. They meshed, right?
Yeah.
Christian Africans, they are evidence of the fact that Christians didn't subjugate and do battle with. They simply convinced them and gave them the light of the truth, and they embraced it. Whereas when you bring Islamic culture and Islamic religion to Africans, they tend to not like it and tend to fight, right?
Well, I mean, when you're told that you have to believe this or die, or in the case of the Middle East, you can be a dhimmi, that didn't seem to happen in Africa. There was just either you take this or you die. Plus, African culture is not as esteemed as, for instance, Arab culture, Middle Eastern culture. And if we're looking at Sudan, the people in Sudan are told your African culture is not worth what our culture as Arabs is worth. Even going back to the Nubians, 2 of the pharaohs of Egypt, 2 dynasties, were Nubians. They were black African pharaohs from Nubia. And yet we look at African culture dismissively. And in the same way today, we look at the warnings and the advice that the Africans in Sudan try to give us about this regime that is not only committing genocide, but is not only cooperating, but helping to sponsor global jihad. I mean, they were building the caliphate long before ISIS was.
Wow. It reminds me a lot of 2014 through 2016 Syria, where the local people were saying one thing, and on the other hand, amazingly, Western powers got their intelligence about the matter from jihadists. And we funded jihadists. And so we had innocent people being murdered by jihadists in Syria. These were the locals. Their narrative versus a narrative propped up by the United States government, the United Nations, the EU, uniformly along every mainstream media outlet. It was heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
Because I would try to get their message out, and it was so unacceptable to repeat what they said. I would be called a sectarian piece of trash for repeating what the primary victims of ISIS were saying. And that seems similar with Sudan.
Yeah.
You cannot repeat their message without serious, frankly, libel against you.
Yeah, there's a perfect storm of, not valuing black Africans, not valuing Christians, which, we saw in the Middle East with Syria and with Iraq. I mean, we had diplomats in Iraq who said, well, Christianity is just an imported religion anyway, isn't it? I mean, hello?
Duh.
You don't know that the Bible is based big time in Iraq? You don't know where Mesopotamia is, where Abraham was from, all those things, but that was dismissed. We had people who pushed to have Sharia put into the Iraq Constitution when we had a choice to really make a difference and to keep that out of the Constitution. So we see those same problems, going over and over again. And I don't know, it's the lambs versus the lions, I guess.
Yeah. So Faith, why does this happen? What is the motive behind what frankly, I've been interviewed on this topic before, roughly, on the topic of persecuted minorities in the Middle East. I gave their perspective. The host would say, wow, I've never heard that. And then the host would say, why do you think people are giving this false narrative? And I would say, I'm baffled. No idea. Only explanation I have is that I believe that there is such a thing as Satan. What is your explanation? Why does the West, why do we tend to ignore the most persecuted party in situations like that in Sudan?
That's a good question. And I think at root of it, you're right. It's Satan. It's demonic. It's part of Satan's attempt to destroy the whole world because, there's plenty of Bible verses that prophesy about Sudan and talk about the people, the tall people with a strange speech and smooth skin from a land divided by rivers who will make their offerings to the Lord God Almighty. And I believe that Satan is trying to stop the plans that God has for Sudan and South Sudan, if you look at the whole country before it was divided. Then I also think a lot of it is political correctness. That it's just not kosher to talk about the Christians as the victims, or even, to say that Islam is victimizing people,
right,
whether they're Christians or Muslims. Darfur, it's Muslims. Nuba Mountains, it's 50-50. So there's a lot of reasons. And I think right now with the lifting of sanctions, there is a feeling that, nothing's as bad as it was because Sudan has done such a great job of covering up for itself and lying. They lie really well. But, there's all these trade opportunities, and Saudi Arabia wants us to be friends with Sudan. So, if we want to make Saudi Arabia happy, we need to give Sudan a break.
Right.
Reasons like that. They've promised us that they're not going to be in a relationship with Iran anymore. That's a big one, but, that's a lie too.
Right. Yeah, this is so tied into the Middle Eastern quagmire. But you've traveled to Sudan yourself, haven't you, quite a bit?
Only South Sudan. I would probably not be let in to the country in Sudan, and not sure that I'd want to try, except maybe going across the border without letting them know I'm in town. But no, I've been to South Sudan twice and hope by the grace of God to go back again before too long.
You have friends there.
I do. I have lots of friends there, from the top of the government down to children in an elementary school.
Right. Now, it seems to me like it's an exceptional thing to do what you're doing, to be that involved, to be that deeply involved in ensuring the well-being of Sudanese minorities. But if an American Christian were to be interested to follow up on this, what steps could they take?
They should talk to Sudanese and South Sudanese people. I mean, that's the main thing. For me, this is relationships. So it's not just an issue or a cause, but it's actual relationships. And they can find out whether there are people who came as refugees from Sudan to their community, South Sudanese people who came years ago as the original refugees, the former Lost Boys, or people who have come more recently from Darfur or Nuba Mountains. And if they can't find it themselves, hey, they can get in touch with me if they want, and I can let them know if there's a Sudanese or South Sudanese community in their area. But that's the main thing to do first, to get to know some people from Sudan and South Sudan and find out the real story of what's going on, and then see how you can be involved. There's a lot of ways to be involved here in the U.S., just in terms of, we had this big campaign to try to not get the sanctions lifted. Unfortunately, we lost that, but we're going to continue to fight, and particularly I'm going to continue exposing the truth that we know about Sudan until the Trump administration says, we got this wrong. They fooled us, Basically, they rolled the Trump administration, and we need to get that known.
Faith, I love what you said. This is about relationships. It's not just a political movement. You're friends with these people. And I think that is potentially an antidote to many things that are wrong in Christian witness and Christian activism and Christian charity today. I grew up very closely surrounded with people who were in the welfare system and were lifelong and sometimes even generations-long recipients of welfare checks. And I saw that was damaging to people. It actually hurts the culture. It hurts people, hurts families, and so forth. And I noticed that the people that were the biggest defenders of government programming as a solution to poverty and social ills were people who themselves didn't have any friends in that world, you see? Don't you think that could help, like you said, about getting to know Sudanese? What do you think of that as a solution to some of the misconceptions we have as a Christian community?
Yeah, I do. I think it's very important. I've seen it in a lot of ways. I've even seen, getting to hear the stories of the former lost boys or people who had been redeemed out of slavery in Sudan, how that changed the liberal Episcopalians who wouldn't hear one bad word about Islam. Suddenly, they got to be friends with these people who came from the same church that they did, the Episcopal Church of Sudan, talking about what had been done to them in the name of Islam. And suddenly, they were a lot more open to believing that, there may be some parts of Islam that are really not helpful. So that's one way that has changed things. And I think another way is, like what you said, this has helped some liberals, not just liberal Christians, but liberal atheists and liberal Jews who really care and have a relationship with the people in Sudan, to look at people like me and say, wow, she's not the horrible person that I would have thought she would be as a Christian, going right back to where you started with the evangelicals. But we have gotten to know and respect and love each other by working side by side together with our Sudanese brothers and sisters. So I think this is like a remedy for division in the United States.
Wow, right. In other words, no matter what your background, draw near to the vulnerable and the hurting, and we'll meet there.
Yeah.
I like that. I think that's a great solution. Well, thank you again very much for being with me, Faith. I can't recommend Faith's work enough, and it's hard to communicate a lot of the work you do because you do such intricate and hard work, especially with regard to Sudan. But I want people to learn more about that, and I will be following up on it as well and getting to know more about it.
Thanks a lot, Stephen.
Yeah. Thank you, and safe times in D.C. I hear it's pretty smoggy and even a little swampy there.
Yeah, well, we're hoping that the swamp will be disappearing.
All right.
Or drained.
Or drained, exactly. Well, you do your part, and I'll do mine. Let's drain it.
Okay.
All right. Well,
thanks a lot. God bless.
God bless you, too. Thank you. Well, that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour, chemically proven to reduce ignorance in both males and females. I'm your host, Stephen Herreid. See you next week.
Oh, yeah, baby.